Trespass at a Winchester Virginia Espresso Bar by Robert X. Bishop. The officer's nameplate read Martinez. Robert noticed this first, not the papers in the man's hand, not the smaller officer standing silent behind him, not even the cafe owner skulking in the corner like a child who'd tattled and now feared consequences. Martinez had kind eyes, the kind that had seen enough to know the difference between threat and tragedy. Robert appreciated that immediately. Robert Muir. Martinez's voice was respectful, almost apologetic. Yes, officer. I need to serve you with trespass papers for this establishment. Robert had ordered his usual, a latte and a blueberry muffin, less than 3 minutes ago. The espresso machine was still hissing behind the counter. He could smell the coffee, that particular brightness of a well-pulled shot. Funny what the mind holds on to in moments like these. Not fear, not even surprise. Just the smell of coffee and the recognition that when police officers show up asking for you by name, it's going to be a bad day. Except Robert had known worse days. The thought arrived unbidden. Moscow, 1991. 3 officers. The mayor's men. That had been a day. That had been a moment when the membrane between living and not living had grown so thin Robert could see through it to the other side. He'd hired 2 of those officers on the spot. Cash, American dollars, the universal language of survival, and sent the 3rd back with a message. I'm worth more to you alive than dead. The same principle applied here, though the stakes were infinitely smaller. Or were they? Robert had learned over his many lifetimes, and yes, he thought of them that way. Distinct lifetimes compressed into a single span of years, that the spiritual mathematics of a moment had nothing to do with its scale. The courage required to love someone pointing a gun at you was the same courage required to love someone wielding the petty power of municipal trespass laws. He thought about the young man who assaulted him, his mind always looking for connections. Remembered a similar situation in 1986. Robert and his friends, idealists, engineers, people who understood that the end of the Cold War terrified certain powerful interests more than nuclear annihilation ever had. The military-industrial complex had built empires on the premise of perpetual threat. When the Soviet Union began to crumble, when the possibility of actual peace emerged, ABC and elements within the U.S. government launched their massive psychological operation, America with a K, a mini-series designed to keep Americans afraid, to prolong the profitable machinery of conflict. Robert and his friends had created counter-programming, nearly real-time television from the Soviet Union for a week. Not propaganda, just people. Russians being Russian. Kazakhs being Kazakh. Human beings on the other side of the Iron Curtain doing human things. Laughing, arguing, cooking, living. The major networks wouldn't touch it. Too risky. Too real. Then someone within the government informed him that the Discovery Channel, barely alive in its embryonic years, was about to go dark. They'd carried the programming, and it had become the most popular show on cable that year. The Discovery Channel didn't just survive, it thrived. The Cable Ace Award was nice, but what mattered was what came after. A network that would shape decades of media, that would bring science and nature and human curiosity into millions of homes. And the Soviet people, they'd seen themselves reflected back not as enemies but as neighbors. The transition from Cold War to peace, from Soviet to Russian, from ideology to humanity, had been eased by that small act of counter-programming. How many lives had that touched? Millions, certainly. The network alone reached that many. But the ripples, the children who grew up watching Discovery instead of war propaganda, the scientists inspired, the minds opened, Those consequences spread across time in ways Robert would never fully understand, and now he was an old man standing in a coffee shop in Winchester, Virginia, being served trespass papers because a weak woman, with a small power, had colluded with an angry young man who worked for the city. The spiritual mathematics were identical. In Moscow, he'd chosen to see the humanity in men sent to kill him. In the Soviet Union, he'd chosen to show Americans the humanity in their supposed enemies. Here, now, he chose to see the humanity in a cafe owner whose fear and hate made her cruel, in a young man whose mind had been infected with rage, with what could be called a virus of the mind, in a small-statured police officer whose Napoleonic complex made him thirst for any small moments of power he could find. The scale didn't matter. The principle was the same. Love. Not sentiment, but the fierce choice to recognize the sacred in every moment, every connection, every person, was the only force powerful enough to transform anything. Whether you were preventing a war or being ejected from a coffee shop, the question remained the same. Will you choose love, or will you choose fear? Or even hate? Robert had always chosen love, even when it cost him everything. Love. That was the word that mattered. Not the sentimental kind, not the greeting card version. The kind that looked directly at weakness and cruelty and chose compassion anyway. The kind that understood. The owner is dangerous precisely because she is weak. The cafe owner, he'd never learned her name, not in all the years he'd spent thousands of dollars annually in her establishment, was short, plain, burdened by an inferiority complex so obvious it might as well have been a second shadow. Robert had recognized it immediately, the way he'd been trained to recognize personality types during his years in law enforcement and intelligence work. He observed, analyzed, categorized, and pattern-matched exactly the way someone with intelligence, law enforcement, investigative, or counterintelligence experience would do. He had been trained to accept that weak people were always the most dangerous. They hoarded their small powers like dragons hoarded gold, and they struck not from strength, but from the fear of their own insignificance. But he was also a scientist, and that training told him he could also be wrong. He'd known she disliked him from the beginning. During his homeless months, when cancer-induced kidney failure had filled his blood with toxins and he couldn't shower for weeks at a time, he'd tried to stay away from other customers, tried to make himself small, but she'd watched him with that particular contempt, the barely secure reserve for the visibly broken. Maybe her contempt for the homeless and the down and out came from her own self-loathing, but that was more of a question than a diagnosis. Even after he'd recovered somewhat, after the experimental treatments had given him a few more years, she'd found reasons to harass him. The mask must be worn between sips during COVID. His bicycle not allowed parked in back, while others were. 1,000 small cruelties, each one a way of saying, I have power here, and you have none. What she didn't understand, what weak people never understood, was that Robert had already lost everything that could be taken. His wealth, mostly inaccessible in a numbered account in Cyprus, his health, ravaged by cancer and its treatments, his marriage, destroyed by mental illness and betrayal, his reputation, his career, his various identities across various lifetimes, all of it gone or going. What remained was the only thing that had ever mattered, the choice, in each moment, to create something beautiful. To love even, especially when hated. Yesterday, the young man from the city had assaulted him. Not in a brutal physical way, though Robert had seen in his eyes the capacity for it. The young man was in his late 20s or early 30s, controlled by what Robert called the mind virus, that particular species of ideological rage that turned human beings into walking time bombs. Robert and his mild-mannered friend had been discussing constitutional law, nothing more. The young man had overheard, stood up, slapped Robert on the shoulder to make certain he was being acknowledged, and unleashed a tirade of insults and threats. Robert, 70-something and dying slowly, had felt no fear. Only pity. Only the recognition that this young man was suffering, that the hate consuming him was a fire that would eventually burn through everything he loved. He was a victim of yet another psyop, like America with a K, only this one designed to keep half of America angry at the other half, to prolong the profitable machinery of conflict. Robert and his friend had simply left. No escalation, no response. Just two men walking away from violence they had no interest in feeding. And now this. The young man from the city had colluded with the cafe owner, he wielding the small power of his municipal position, she wielding the small power of her establishment, to have Robert banned from the one place in Winchester where he'd found something like normalcy, where he could feed his birds, where he could meet friends, where he could sit and remember what it felt like to be part of his once extraordinary world. They'd felt emboldened because the machinery had already aligned. Hate has found hate and metastasized. Robert had written to the mayor of Winchester a careful, measured letter explaining the situation, the assault, the cafe owner's weaponization of city connections, and law enforcement against a citizen who'd done nothing but maintain his dignity. The mayor had never responded. Not a word. Not an acknowledgement. Just institutional silence. Robert tried to analyze the situation. Perhaps the mayor feared what power a man with Robert's intelligence background might still have, the kind of power that had accumulated across his lifetimes in law enforcement and covert operations, the corridors where real power actually exists. Or more likely, it was simpler. Political expediency. The cafe owner had connections. Robert had been a homeless man with renal failure and no advocates. The mathematics of municipal power were clear. When you can eliminate an inconvenient person through official channels without consequence, why wouldn't you? This was how cities erased people. This is how the homeless are disappeared, not through violence. That left evidence, created liability, but through the quiet deployment of institutional machinery. Trespass papers. Police visits. The transformation of a citizen into a non-person, legally excluded from public accommodation, officially unwelcome. All of it procedurally correct. All of it professionally executed. All of it was violence nonetheless. The mayor's silence was its own form of violence, a choice to let the weak and the rageful have their way, because intervening would cost something. Political capital, perhaps, or simply the effort of caring about someone who didn't matter in the calculus of power. Robert would love him too. The mayor, the young man, the cafe owner, all of them. Because the spiritual mathematics didn't change based on scale or institutional position. Love was love. The choice was the choice. And Robert had already practiced this at its most difficult, with his now ex-wife, with Moscow assassins, with every betrayal that should have ended love but hadn't. Martinez held out the papers. Robert took them. "Thank you, officer," Robert said. He meant it. Martinez was doing his job professionally, respectfully. He embodied what a peace officer should be. The smaller officer by the door, the one with the Napoleonic complex who'd harassed Robert during the pandemic, stayed silent, perhaps sensing that his presence added nothing. Robert looked at the papers. Legal language. Official seals. The machinery of institutional power deployed against an old man who'd done nothing but maintain his dignity. He thought, every moment is precious. Every connection sacred. Every choice an opportunity to create something beautiful. He thought, I will love her anyway. I will love him anyway. I will love all of them, because love is the only force powerful enough to survive what hate destroys. He thought, this too is a lifetime. This too matters. Martinez was watching him, perhaps expecting anger or argument. Robert met his eyes and smiled, not bitterly, not sarcastically, but with genuine warmth. I understand, Robert said. Thank you for your professionalism. Something shifted in Martinez's expression. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that passed between two men who'd both seen enough to know what mattered and what didn't. Robert folded the papers, put them in his jacket pocket, and walked out into the bright Virginia morning. Behind him, the cafe owner was already turning away, her small victory complete. Ahead of him, the rest of his life, however long or short, waited. He had loved her. He would continue to love her, not because she deserved it, but because love was the most powerful force in the universe, and Robert had nothing left to offer the world but that. The birds were waiting. He had seed in his pocket. The day was beautiful. Every moment was precious. Every moment was enough.